That morning at Los Angeles International Airport began with a moment no one could have predicted, a moment powerful enough to rewrite the fate of an entire airline, a first-class ticket that mysteriously vanished, and a man treated as if he did not belong in the very place he had paid to stand. The cold white lights of the international terminal spilled over endless lines of travelers, turning every movement into something sharp and metallic, and within that tide of bodies, Evan Brooks appeared quiet as a passing breeze, yet carrying the calm of someone who had lived his entire life inside storms. He pushed a grey carry-on suitcase, his black loafers gliding across the polished floor, no curious glances following him. No one realizing that this 45-year-old man was the one who controlled Aurora Air, the very airline he intended to secretly audit that morning. Evan called these trips silent audits, an unwritten ritual he had practiced for years. No bodyguards, no assistants, no CEO privileges, just him and the real world outside, with all its rough edges, honesty, and occasional cruelty. At 7:12 in the morning, the airport buzzed like a shaken beehive, loudspeakers blaring baggage staff, rushing carts, children crying, business travelers, checking their watches as though every second determined life or death. Evan watched it all with steady eyes, so deep they seemed to swallow the chaos around him. He liked this place. He liked its unfiltered truth. He liked that no one knew who he was. And most of all, he liked that no one pretended to be polite just because they feared losing their jobs. He traveled under his familiar alias, Evan Lewis, using his mother's family name, known only to 3 people inside the company. His ticket was for seat 1. Booked a week earlier through his private office, reserving a place for a short business trip to New York before the most important strategy meeting of the quarter. But what made Evan pause in the middle of the crowd and narrow his eyes was not the announcements or the security line stretching across the terminal. It was a familiar feeling, a feeling he had encountered only 3 times in his life, right before he was denied his first loan to start the company, right before a senior executive told him he didn't fit the image of upper management, and now in the moment, he looked toward departure. Gate 36, Bravo. Standing beneath the neon lights was Greg Sullivan, the tall, thin gate supervisor, with graying hair and a suit jacket clasped unevenly, as if he had rushed out without fixing it. Greg's fingers moved across the keyboard in a strange, slow rhythm, deliberate, exaggerated the way people type when they want to flaunt a bit of petty authority over someone they assume is unimportant. Evan knew this type. He had met hundreds, and as long as the company existed, people like Greg would appear again and again. But this morning, Evan never imagined that Greg would become the first link in a chain reaction that would shake everything that followed. Evan approached the counter and offered a polite nod. "Good morning," he said. Greg did not look up, not a flicker of acknowledgement, just more typing. Click, click, click. Each keystroke dragged out like a reminder. "I am busy, and you, who exactly are you?" Evan was used to being judged by appearances, which was why he deliberately wore a plain navy jacket with no logo, a simple white shirt, grey pants, no Rolex, no tie, no leather briefcase, nothing that suggested power. What he wanted was truth. And truth often only reveals itself when people believe you are just another ordinary passenger. "I'm checking in for the Aurora Air flight to New York," Evan repeated. Greg finally lifted his gaze. His eyes skimmed from Evan's face to his shoes, then to his luggage, then back again, cold and sharp as tempered glass. Name Evan Lewis. Greg typed a few keys, narrowed his eyes, and pressed his lips together. 1 beat, 2 beats. Evan felt the shift instantly. Greg looked up again. Seat 1A has been reassigned. Evan's pulse dropped not from fear, but from recognition. That familiar chill of bias he had tasted more times than he cared to remember. "I booked that seat in advance," he said. "I have the confirmation in my email." Greg shrugged without interest. "System shows it was changed. Your seat is 29 Echo. 29 Echo, the middle, near the back of the plane, the place people were stuffed when someone believed they didn't belong." A wave of heat flashed across Evan's chest, sharp and bitter, but he held it down. The insult rose slowly like a tide, yet his expression stayed calm enough to irritate Greg. What Evan did not know, not yet, was that this reassignment was not an error and not a glitch. It was the first strike in a scheme crafted for an entire week, and Greg, the man standing in front of him, was merely the one chosen to pull that first blade. Evan breathed in. He gave a small nod. "All right. I understand." But in his eyes something stirred awake, something stronger than humiliation, deeper than anger, something only people who have been underestimated their entire lives ever learn to control, the cold clarity of someone who knows that when the moment is right, the entire sky will shift in his favor. And that morning, at Los Angeles International Airport, the second hand on the clock had just landed on that moment. Evan was still standing there beneath the cold terminal lights when Kelly Price appeared, a woman in her early 40s, with a straight, rigid posture, eyes sharp as a blade, and a smile that never once reached her eyes. Kelly was the kind of flight attendant any passenger could recognize from afar, not because of dedication, but because of that attitude carved into every step she took. The attitude that said, "I decide who deserves to be where." She approached the gate counter, muttering something under her breath, with such irritation that a few passengers instinctively stepped aside, as if making room for a power they wanted no part of. "Is this him? The one causing the issue?" Kelly shot Evan a quick glance, a glance fast but thorough enough to judge, categorize, and label him. Greg replied with superior confidence, refuses to accept the new seat. Wants to sit in first class. Kelly turned fully toward Evan, her expression a strange mix of disbelief and disdain, as if he had just announced he was royalty from some distant kingdom. "You said you're in seat 1A, she asked, lifting a corner of her lips. "Are you sure, or did you read the ticket wrong?" "Happens all the time. Passengers think they booked first class when they actually booked economy." The words pierced straight into Evan's chest like a poisoned needle. He had heard variations of that sentence countless times in his life, from banks, from store staff, from people who believed he didn't look like someone who belonged in luxury spaces. But today, when Kelly said it in front of so many witnesses, the impact echoed 1,000 times louder. Evan kept his voice steady. "I am sure. I booked correctly. My ticket is for seat 1A. Kelly folded her arms, her eyes sliding down and back up his body for a second inspection. "We don't do free upgrades," she said loudly enough for the line behind him to hear clearly. A few stares turned toward Evan, some irritated, others amused, wearing the smirk of people who enjoyed drama as long as they were not the ones involved. A young white man in a suit whispered something to his girlfriend. She covered her mouth while laughing as if watching a comedy scene unfold. Evan heard everything, felt everything. From every laugh he sensed the echoes of years spent being judged by the color of his skin and the clothes he wore rather than the value he created. Kelly began losing patience. "You will sit in seat 29, Echo," she said coldly, "or we will call security." Evan lifted his gaze and locked eyes with her. "No fear. No retreat. Go ahead," he said. "I want them standing here, listening to this conversation." Greg faltered for a split second. Kelly's eyes widened slightly, as if she could not believe someone who looked like that dared to push back. Then she let out a dry laugh. "Come on," she scoffed. "You're holding up boarding. If you were actually a first-class passenger, you would have been taken care of already. But you're not." Whispers spread through the line like sparks leaping across dry paper. A few passengers had already raised their phones recording. Evan felt the camera lenses pointed at him, not the attention he ever wanted, but the kind that twisted his stomach into knots, public humiliation, disguised as curiosity. His breathing grew heavier for a moment, but his face remained calm. Calm to the point of irritation for the people around him, because beneath that calmness, something dangerous was rising, a deliberate silence. Greg shoved a new boarding pass into Evan's hand, almost throwing it. 29, Echo. Boarding now. If not, you will be removed from the flight. A few years ago, Evan might have argued, or demanded a supervisor, or walked away in anger. But now he simply looked at the paper in his hand seat, 29, Echo, and walked toward the jet bridge. No words. No resistance. No explanations. That silence made Kelly feel as if she had won, and that sense of victory inflated her confidence even more. "See," she told Greg, "people like that are always the same. Think they deserve more than they do." The sentence wasn't meant for Evan to hear, but it cut into his back like a blade as he entered the aircraft. Inside, warm, golden light washed over the first-class cabin. White table linens, crystal-clear glasses, flight attendants pouring fresh orange juice with practiced elegance. Evan walked past seat 1A, where a white man around 55 lounged comfortably reading a newspaper, legs stretched out, completely unaware he was the spark in a much bigger fire. Evan kept walking. Past business class, past premium economy, into row 29, where the smell of snacks, jackets, and the compressed lives of 100 passengers clung to the air. Seat 29, Echo was so small it felt like a trap. To his left, a large man spilled over the armrest. To his right, a young mother held a crying baby. Evan sat down. His shoulders pressed against both sides. The space closed in around him. But what suffocated him wasn't the seat. It was the feeling of being judged, downgraded, classified, all because someone decided he wasn't worthy of seat 1A. The weight dropped onto his chest like stone. Yet beneath the rising wave of emotion, another thought formed, quiet but sharp. They think they know me, but they know nothing. And my silence is what they will remember for the rest of their lives. As the aircraft began to taxi, Evan closed his eyes. Not from exhaustion, but because he was measuring every breath, every movement. Because the moment the plane left the ground, one single moment later, that silence would become the most dangerous weapon he had ever used. And they, the ones in uniform, had no idea what they had just awakened. As the plane tilted gently upward, lifting off the runway and slicing into the white clouds above, Evan opened his eyes. He did not look out the window, nor at the passengers beside him. He stared straight ahead at the worn, grey seatback in front of him, but his gaze was not truly fixed there. It was anchored to a single thought enough, the humiliation at the gate. Kelly's disdainful stare, Greg's smirk, the couple laughing behind him each moment, cut deep, like an old wound that never quite healed. Evan had endured moments like these his entire life when he was 16, and a store guard followed him, convinced he was stealing when he was 23, and denied a loan for being not the right fit for the ideal customer profile when he was 32, and an investment board subtly implied he lacked the refinement to run his company. But today, the reason he sat still was not the familiar sting of those memories. It was something else, a cold clarity that only appeared when the line had been crossed far enough. The seatbelt sign had just switched off, but no one had stood up yet, the cabin still filled with that tense hush that follows takeoff. Evan slipped a hand into his pocket and pulled out a thin black phone, a specialized high-security device connected directly to the operations center of Brooks Global Holdings. No one around him noticed, too busy stretching, digging through bags, calming children. But if they had known that the moment his finger touched the screen would rewrite the history of this flight, perhaps every person on board would have held their breath. Evan opened his contacts and selected one name, Daniel Foster, 48 years old, the company's chief operating officer, his right hand for 12 years, the only person who had ever seen him collapse after a brutal meeting, and the only one steady enough to keep the world standing when Evan could not. The call connected instantly. Evan Daniels' voice was low alert. Evan kept his eyes on the empty space in front of him. His voice was soft, but sharp enough to slice through steel. Daniel, divert the flight. A deadly silence followed. What do you mean, send it to Denver? Executive priority. Activate code 9X. Daniel inhaled sharply on the other end. Denver, is there a technical issue? Is someone injured? A threat on board? No. Evan replied. Just follow the instruction and have the entire board of directors waiting on the runway. Send the security team to the aircraft the moment we land. Daniel paused for a beat. Then he asked the only question that mattered. What did they do? Evan closed his eyes for 3 seconds, then opened them again. His voice dropped steady cold, stripped of every trace of the man who had just been insulted. They forgot who they represent. No further explanation. None needed. Daniel understood, and he was smart enough not to argue. I'll take care of it, he said. Code 9X will force the diversion. No one will question it. Evan ended the call. The man on his left still hogged the armrest. The young mother on his right still struggled to calm her child. Nothing around him had changed, yet Evan felt it unmistakably. The sky had shifted. Up front, the pilots who had never encountered an executive override code before stared at the navigation screen in utter confusion. And at that exact moment in the cockpit, Captain McConnell frowned at the flashing alert. Aurora Operations Executive Override, 9X, divert to Denver immediately. He exhaled sharply. What on earth? No storms, no mechanical issues, no security warnings. First Officer Thorne looked at him, face draining of color. Are we violating protocol? No, McConnell answered, though the uncertainty cracked through his voice. Only one person has the authority to sign a 9X code, who the CEO of Aurora Air. But the CEO isn't on this flight. The unfinished sentence hung heavy in the air. Evan didn't need to hear any of it to know exactly what was happening. He watched the route map on the seat monitor as the straight line to New York curved slightly, like a stroke of ink pulled off course. No one noticed but him. He sensed every tiny shift, every vibration, every decision, as though the entire aircraft had become a body responding to his thoughts. Are you all right? The young mother beside him asked her baby, finally quiet for a moment. Evan turned to her with a small smile. "I'm fine." "Thank you." Beneath that smile was a truth stretched tight like a violin string. Moments before it snaps, they had no idea who they had crossed. Meanwhile, in first class, Kelly Price sat down in the galley and poured herself a Diet Coke. She hadn't taken a sip when the tablet vibrated violently. A red alert, flashing crew alert, all flight attendants report to the first-class galley. Do not inform passengers. No interaction unless requested. Note Mr. Evan Lewis equals Mr. Evan Brooks. Kelly read it a second time. A third. Her throat dried. Goosebumps rippled up her arms and across her neck. No impossible Greg Sullivan received his internal call 15 seconds later. His eyes darted wildly as Kelly whispered, "We sent the CEO of the airline to seat 29 Echo." They stood frozen for several seconds, panic rising through them like an icy tide. But this tide carried a metallic taste, the flavor of a future collapsing in real time. Back in row 29, Evan leaned his head against the seat, his breath steady. No more anger. No more humiliation. Only the absolute stillness of a man who knew exactly what he had just set in motion. One call, 12 minutes after takeoff, and the sky obediently changed direction. Evan closed his eyes not to rest, but to prepare. Because the moment the plane touched down in Denver, every mask of the employees of the system, of the one who orchestrated the scheme, would fall, and he would be the one standing at the end of the runway watching everything exposed under the unforgiving white light of truth. The wheels touched down on the Denver runway with a softness so precise it was hard to believe the pilots had just executed an emergency diversion. Yet that very smoothness carried an unsettling tension, as if the sky itself was holding its breath before the real storm began. Evan opened his eyes as the Boeing decelerated, his hands resting lightly on his knees, his breathing steady as though he had been preparing for this moment his entire life. He didn't need to look out the window to know what waited outside. He had felt it the moment the 9X code was sent, the chaos beneath the professional veneer, the frantic calls, the security vehicles racing toward the tarmac, and a line of powerful executives already gathered to face the earthquake he had triggered with a single call. "We're in Denver," the young mother beside him asked, eyes wide. "Yes," Evan replied calmly. His answer made her shrink back slightly, sensing that the man beside her was not an ordinary passenger. Meanwhile, in first class, Greg Sullivan and Kelly Price stood at rigid attention, like two offenders awaiting sentencing. Their eyes were fixed on the cabin door, where two security officers in black suits had just stepped inside, silent and expressionless, present without explanation. Greg swallowed hard. Kelly felt her knees threatening to give out. They knew this had escalated far beyond internal discipline. This was the moment careers turned to ash. Captain McConnell opened the cockpit door and stepped out, his face tight. "We wait for handling instructions," he said, though his tone landed squarely on Greg and Kelly like a warning. The air inside the cabin thickened, almost fog-like, heavy enough that passengers were whispering among themselves. Who on this flight is powerful enough to redirect a plane? Who has that kind of authority? When the seatbelt sign dimmed, no one stood up. Every gaze turned to the aisle as Evan Brooks rose slowly from seat 29 Echo. He did not rush. He did not hesitate. He did not look around for attention. He didn't need to. Attention poured toward him like water down a slope. Evan adjusted his sleeve and rolled his neck slightly, as if preparing to walk into a boardroom rather than the aftermath of a storm someone else had created. As he walked down the aisle, passengers murmured, some lifting their phones, not to mock this time, but because they sensed they were about to witness something far larger than a gate dispute. Kelly saw him first, her face drained of color. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Greg didn't even dare look up. He stood trembling, trying desperately to cling to whatever dignity he could salvage. Evan stopped directly in front of them, his expression not angry, but calm in the way only someone holding absolute authority could manage. "Please step off the aircraft," Evan said, his voice low, but echoing through the cabin like metal struck against metal. Greg stammered, I'm truly sore, don't call me sir." Now Evan cut in his voice, freezing the air between them. "You had the chance to show respect when I was still traveling under the name Evan Lewis." A passenger in the mid-cabin inhaled sharply. Kelly bowed her head, her legs stiff as she tried to move. They walked the aisle like offenders, escorted through a gauntlet, and the passengers who had witnessed them humiliating Evan earlier now stepped aside, as if afraid of brushing against something contaminated. Evan stood still, watching them leave the plane, saying nothing, but that silence was the harshest judgment of all. When the aircraft door opened, bright white security lights flooded in alongside a row of black SUVs lining the runway, making many passengers feel as if they had stepped into a crime drama scene. Evan turned back to face the cabin. "My name is Evan Brooks," he said, each syllable landing with absolute clarity, like a declaration before a jury. A wave rippled through the passengers. "Brooks, the CEO Aurora Air. I am the one who booked seat 1A this morning," Evan continued, "and I am the one who was told I did not belong there." Those who had laughed earlier now lowered their heads. A young woman covered her mouth cheeks, flushed with shame. The young man who had whispered mockery turned away, wishing he could disappear. Evan wasn't angry. He wasn't bitter. He simply stated the truth. And the truth was powerful enough to silence an entire cabin. "I was humiliated, not because of a system error," he said, "but because of a culture that has allowed contempt to become a habit." Captain McConnell and his first officer stood in the cockpit doorway listening intently. Even they seemed aware they were witnessing a moment that future lawyers' communications teams and Aurora Air's internal training programs would reference for years. Evan stepped off the plane without looking back. When his shoes met the Denver tarmac, a security team parted to make way for him. The executive board members, people who had never been required to wait for anyone except him, now stood lined up outside the private terminal, straightening their posture instinctively as he approached. Not because of his title, but because they had just witnessed a truth they had forgotten. Real power doesn't need to shout. It only needs to stand up at the right moment. A cold wind swept across the runway. Evan drew in a full breath, as if clearing away the residue of humiliation others had tried to place on him. And in that moment, with every eye locked onto him, with the lights of Denver blazing across the tarmac, he understood one thing clearly: this wasn't the battle. This was only the opening act. The man in seat 1A, the man Greg and Kelly had treated as the more important passenger, was not placed there by coincidence. And Evan would not leave Denver until that curtain was ripped wide open. A curtain hiding a scheme far bigger than a first-class seat. A scheme aimed directly at him, and he was ready to walk straight into its center. The conference room on the 23rd floor of Brooks Global Holdings had never been this silent. No rustling papers, no clicking pens, only the heavy stillness of air so dense it felt as though every particle carried the weight of an unspoken accusation. The 6-meter walnut table reflected the tense faces Of the 8 board members, people who once believed they controlled the company's future, now sitting upright like students caught in a surprise exam. The door opened without a sound. Evan walked in. No assistant trailing behind him, no secretary carrying documents, only him and that cold, quiet fire burning behind his eyes. Daniel Foster followed, holding a tablet that contained every system log. When Evan reached the head of the table, no one dared speak. No one dared swallow. No one dared breathe too loudly. He did not sit. He allowed the silence to settle over them like a suspended sentence, making each person feel as though the chair beneath them had shrunk, hardened, and no longer belonged to them. "You've all seen the news," Evan said, his voice, not loud, but slicing through the room like a blade, scraping across the table. "And you all know why we're here." Some exchanged glances. A few tried to appear calm, but their reddening eyes betrayed them as they avoided Evan's gaze, like surgeons avoiding the glare of their own operating lamps. Daniel placed the tablet on the table and opened the first file. "The system has been checked," he said. There was no technical error, no glitch. Seat 1A was never automatically reassigned. Evan scanned the table slowly, letting his gaze rest on each face, one at a time. "Good," he said. "That means the seat change was deliberate." A ripple of tension ran through the room. Evan clasped his hands behind his back. "So the next question is who did it?" No one answered. Evan knew they didn't have the answer, but he also knew the silence wasn't ignorance. It was fear. "Let me ask this differently," Evan said, lowering his voice, half a tone, doubling the danger in it. "Who has access to the internal terminal at the Atlanta office, the one that registered the override command for seat 1A at 6:47 this morning?" Daniel swiped across the screen. "Only 3 people," he replied. "Myself, Linda Carver, Chief Financial Officer, and—" He paused, not because he forgot, because he didn't want to say it. Evan fixed his eyes on Daniel, and Thomas Whitfield. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. 2 board members exchanged terrified glances. One tugged his sleeve as if he couldn't believe what he had just heard. Whitfield. Evan tilted his head slightly, confirming the suspicion that had sparked the moment he saw the man calmly reading a newspaper in seat 1A. Thomas Whitfield, 56-years-old veteran investor, former board member, now a major stakeholder, quietly pushing for a hostile restructuring. A fox who knew how to use the law to bite without leaving teeth marks. Linda Carver spoke first, trying to distance herself from the circle of suspicion. "It could be someone at the Atlanta office," she said quickly. "An IT staffer. Someone logging in with a borrowed credential." Daniel shook his head, his voice firm as steel. The command came from the terminal inside Whitfield's private office. It required his security card. It cannot be forged. Another board member grasped for the last fragment of hope. Maybe he just wanted to change seats. Evan let out a laugh, but the sound made every spine in the room tighten. He wanted to change seats. Evan repeated, his eyes darkening. "Coincidentally, on the exact day I traveled under an alias. Coincidentally, the exact seat I booked, and the exact person the staff was instructed to treat differently." Daniel tapped the screen again. An email appeared, from Whitfield's assistant, sent to Kelly Price, 3 days ago. The message contained 4 words, alias Evan Lewis. "Seat 1A, if possible, adjust." The room collectively flinched as though slapped. Whitfield hadn't just known Evan was traveling. He knew the alias. He knew the seat. And he wanted adjustments in how Evan was treated. Evan closed his eyes for 1 second. Just one. When he opened them, his gaze was sharp enough to cut through bone. So Evan said he wanted me humiliated, publicly, in front of passengers, in front of cameras, to create the image that I was losing control. He looked around the table. And why no one answered. Evan did it for them, to accelerate the takeover. In that moment, everyone seated there finally understood this was not about a seat, not about a moment of bias. This was a calculated attack on the CEO of the corporation, a political knife thrust in broad daylight inside an airport that had seemed harmless. Harold Pierce spoke up, his voice trembling. Evan, I think we shouldn't turn this into a witch hunt. Evan turned to him slowly. Do I look like someone hunting witches to you? His voice was not raised, but the coldness in it forced Pierce to swallow hard. No one moved. Evan stood tall, placing one hand on the edge of the table. I walked off that aircraft in front of hundreds of people. They didn't know whether to clap or be afraid. And I don't care. He paused, lowering his voice, each word landing like a war drum before a storm. But here's what I do care about: who in this system believes they have the right to decide where I belong. Daniel glanced down at the tablet again. There's more. The internal camera at the Atlanta office recorded Whitfield entering at 6:45, 2 minutes before the override. There was no room left for denial. No place to hide. No doubt strong enough to shield him. Evan stood there, his shadow stretching across the table like a warning carved in the grain of the wood. I have been silent too long. And you mistook that silence for weakness. He inhaled once, then delivered the sentence that made every hand grip the armrests tighter. Now we start cleaning house. Outside the conference room, the Denver sky glowed pale blue. But inside, every word Evan spoke was laying the foundation for the earthquake that would shake Aurora Air to its core, not because he had been insulted, but because someone believed he would bow. And that was the greatest mistake they had ever made. The room remained frozen after the words "clean house," and the silence that followed was no longer just tension. It felt like the sky holding still before a lightning strike. Evan's gaze swept across each board member, leaving them with the unsettling sensation that he was seeing straight through their shoulders, through the layer of professionalism they use to hide their compromises and cowardice. Before we begin, Evan said, placing both hands on the table, I want all of you to understand something. What happened this morning was not a mistake. Not carelessness. Not an employee overstepping. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping lower, but becoming so sharp that the air itself seemed to split in half. This was a strike, direct, calculated, and aimed squarely at me. Linda Carver, the chief financial officer, adjusted her glasses with trembling fingers, her voice shaking as though she was trying to regain her heartbeat. Evan, perhaps we should examine this further. We can't definitively say Whitfield intended. Evan tapped the table once. Not hard, but firm enough to make the entire surface quiver. Linda. He sent my alias, my seat number, told them to adjust if possible. And the override command came from his terminal. What exactly do you want to consider? Linda fell silent. Harold Pierce, the oldest member in the room, attempted to salvage a shred of authority. Evan, I understand you're upset. But for such a conspiracy to take place, it's extremely serious. I don't believe Whitfield would be reckless enough. Evan looked straight at him, and Harold stopped mid-sentence, as if the coldness in Evan's eyes had slapped him into stillness. You don't think I'm important enough for someone to take that risk? Harold opened his mouth, but no words followed. Evan turned and walked toward the large display screen behind the table. Daniel handed him the remote. Evan pressed a button, and a list of financial statements appeared, dozens of transactions scattered over the past 4 weeks. The room seemed to lose its air. "Look," Evan said. His voice was no longer cold. It was the unsheathed edge of a blade. Whitfield and his 2 partners acquired an additional 2.4% of shares in 3 weeks. They split the purchases through subsidiaries, trust accounts, and shadow investments. He pointed at the screen. This is not coincidence. He pressed another button. Emails appeared. Then another. And another, all pointing back to Whitfield. All discussing leadership adjustments, executive restructuring, and preparing shareholder alignment for a potential vote to remove the CEO. Someone swallowed so loudly it echoed across the room. "My God," someone whispered. Daniel picked up where Evan did not need to. If Evan had lost control this morning, if he had yelled, argued, or resisted the staff, the footage would have gone viral, and Whitfield would have used it to convince shareholders that the CEO was too unstable to lead. Evan turned around, and in his eyes was not just anger but the ache of betrayal from a man he had once given a chance. "They wanted me to break," Evan said slowly. "They wanted me to hang myself with my own image." He paused. 1 beat, 2 beats, but they forgot one thing. He straightened his voice, lowering, anchored by steel forged in fire. "I don't break that easily." A wave of emotion moved through the room. Some members straightened, some lowered their eyes, but all of them felt the shift Evan, stepping out of the role of victim and into the command of the battlefield. Daniel opened one final file, an internal recording between Whitfield's assistant and an Atlanta office manager. "Remember this. When he shows up, just say, 'The system made a mistake.' People like him never have enough confidence to argue. People like him." The words stabbed into Evan's chest like a poison-tipped blade. He listened to the recording, then said nothing. He simply closed his eyes for 3 seconds. When he opened them again, the disappointment in his gaze was deeper than any anger. Not disappointment at the insult itself, but at the truth it revealed that inside the very company he built with pride and relentless resolve, there were people who still believed he was not the right type to sit at the head of the table. "All right," Evan said, his voice returning to its sharp, frigid clarity. "We've seen the evidence. Now we choose our course." He looked at Daniel. "Initiate a full investigation. Understood. Suspend all personnel connected to the Atlanta office until further notice. I'll do it immediately. And notify legal counsel." Evan spoke slowly, each word deliberate. "We are suing Whitfield not only for sabotage, but for a calculated defamation attempt." Shock rippled across the room. Linda shot to her feet. "Suing Whitfield. He's a major shareholder. This lawsuit will explode across the entire company." Evan looked right at her. "Good." Linda stepped back as if struck. Evan turned to the entire table. "Good, because this will be the first time this company is forced to look at itself. To look at the culture that allowed someone like Whitfield to believe he could strip me of my dignity with a single, 'First class isn't for someone like you.'" Daniel didn't speak, but the unwavering support in his eyes was unmistakable rare for someone as composed as a chief operating officer. Evan drew a slow breath, his voice low, but echoing like a battle drum. "If we let this go, it won't just be me. Anyone who doesn't fit the comfort zone of the powerful will become the next target." He placed both hands on the table and leaned forward slightly. "I didn't build this company for it to become a place where people use skin color influence or connections to decide who deserves respect. Another silence fell. But this time it wasn't fear. It was agreement. A kind of respect the room had never held before. Evan straightened and turned toward the door. "We start today." He paused for 1 second before stepping out. "And if anyone doesn't want to walk with me," he looked back, his eyes sharp as a blade. "The door is right behind you." No one moved. No one stood. In that moment, everyone understood the takeover battle had been ignited, and Evan Brooks had just stepped into the role of commanding general. But more than that, they knew this fire would not only burn Whitfield's scheme to ash, it would burn away every rotten corner of the company's culture, and Evan would not extinguish the flames until nothing left could threaten his dignity or the dignity of anyone like him inside the very company he built. Right after leaving the boardroom, Evan walked straight to the executive office, where Daniel had already assembled a legal team and several senior leaders. No one spoke loudly, but everyone looked at him with a kind of recognition rarely given to any CEO. The understanding that the man entering the room was not just leading a corporation, but leading a battle for dignity. Daniel handed Evan a thin folder. "Temporary termination orders," he said. "Greg Sullivan and Kelly Price. No negotiation. No reinstatement." Evan signed immediately. His pen moved with precise, unwavering strokes, like someone who had been waiting for this moment ever since he was forced into seat 29 Echo. Not because he wanted personal revenge, but because if he didn't act, the system would quietly wipe the stain away as if nothing had happened, and that same toxic loop would continue to strangle people with less power than him. "Announce it internally," Evan said. "And tell communications to prepare a statement. Direct, honest, no sugarcoating." Daniel nodded. An executive assistant nearby trembled slightly, as though overwhelmed by the sudden number of changes unfolding in a single day. But Evan wasn't finished. Now he said, "Whitfield." The legal team's 6 attorneys inhaled sharply at the same time. A blonde woman, the head of legal, spoke first. "Evan suing a major shareholder, it will cause shock waves. The stock will fluctuate. The media will explode with headlines. This could become a battle that lasts months, even years." Evan looked straight at her without blinking. "I don't need a fast battle. I need the right one." The answer silenced the entire legal team. Then, one by one, they nodded. They all understood Evan was not a man who postured for theatrics. If he had decided to sue Whitfield, it meant he was prepared to fight to the end, and no one would be able to pull him back. Daniel activated the large screen. "We have enough evidence for internal sabotage, breach of confidentiality, intentional defamation of the CEO, and, if you agree, we can escalate this to systemic racial discrimination." Someone on the legal team asked quietly, "Where do you want to begin?" Evan turned his voice deep and resonant like a metal bell. "Begin with the truth." His first principle had always been transparency. He didn't want to win through scandal. He wanted to repair the foundation, which was why just a few hours later, the company-wide virtual town hall broadcast to nearly 40,000 employees worldwide was announced. A simple stage, a single microphone, white overhead lights. Evan stepped up. No teleprompter, no script, no expensive suit. Only him in a rolled-sleeve white shirt, the symbol of a CEO choosing to stand beside his employees, not above them. Today he began, "I'm not speaking to you as the CEO. I'm speaking as a passenger who was called a pretender." Across thousands of live connections, murmurs rose. Evan recounted the entire event without embellishment, without anger, without portraying himself as a victim. Just the truth laid bare, with a calmness that made people shiver. When he said, "They told me I didn't belong in first class," dozens of chat windows exploded. Unbelievable, this happened to me. "Thank you for speaking up. We stand with you." Evan breathed in slowly and continued, "I could have stayed silent. I could have let it pass. But silence is not progress. Silence is complicity." Employees watching from Boston, Chicago, Houston, Seattle, Los Angeles fell quiet. Some nodded. Some cried. Some turned away ashamed of the times they had ignored unfairness, because they believed that's just the way things are. Evan announced 3 major decisions. First, mandatory bias training for every employee, from pilots to the board of directors. Second, a new anonymous reporting system operating independently outside the management chain. Third, a mentorship program dedicated to employees of color immigrants and women, the people who often found themselves at the end of the line in advancement. A department head in Seattle asked, "Are you sure the board will approve this?" Evan looked straight into the camera. "They don't have the authority to refuse." In that moment, tens of thousands of employees saw something the media never captured correctly. Real power isn't loud. Real power is the kind of presence that makes an entire system stop and listen. After the town hall, break rooms across the company erupted into discussion. Andre Miller, a customer service agent in Chicago, stood up during an internal meeting, voice shaking with years of restraint. "What happened to Evan happens to us every day. They tell us to lower your tone, don't be emotional, look more presentable. But really it's always about skin color." Evan watched the live stream and felt his chest tighten, not with pain, but with recognition. Over the next 4 days, Evan visited 4 major hubs. He didn't deliver speeches. He didn't pose for photos. He simply listened to stories of rude passengers, biased managers, and countless moments when employees had been made to feel small, when a Latina gate agent cried and said, "My supervisor said I should rise above insults, because that's the job, but all I feel is smaller." Evan placed a hand on her shoulder and said, "You are not invisible." The word spread quickly. Some employees were moved. Some said he was going too far. Some board members were furious. Harold Pierce slammed his fist on the table during a closed-door meeting. "You're turning a small incident into a social crusade. You're going to get us sued." Evan turned to him. "Patience gone. You're more worried about lawsuits than about your own employees being mistreated." Harold went quiet. Evan didn't wait for an answer. "If anyone in this room thinks I'm going too far," he said, "then remember, none of this would be happening if we had done the right thing from the start." The room froze. But for the first time, Evan didn't care what they felt. He cared about justice, a justice taken from him at the departure gate that morning. As he left the meeting, Evan paused by the glass window, looking down at the runway, where planes took off and landed like the company's heartbeat. And he knew the fight had only begun. Ahead of him were Whitfield, the forces behind the takeover plot, and the long-standing walls of a toxic culture years in the making. But this time, Evan was not fighting alone. He had the truth. He had his entire workforce behind him. And most importantly, he had the resolve to never again let anyone use a seat, whether 1A or 29 Echo, to decide his worth for even a single moment. In the days following the town hall, Brooks Global Holdings felt like a ship forced into a new direction under the pull of a rising storm. No one stood still. No one stayed quiet. In Chicago, Seattle, Houston, Boston, Los Angeles, Every break room suddenly became a place where people finally spoke about the things they once had to swallow in silence, stories that would have been labeled sensitive, inappropriate, or we'll deal with it later, if said in front of management. But now, after their CEO, the most powerful person in the company, had been publicly humiliated and dared to stand up and tell the truth, they felt they too had the right to be heard, to speak, to exist. Evan watched everything through internal live streams, and every story employees shared tightened his chest a little more. Not from pain, but from awakening. A quiet awakening, powerful enough to topple rotting towers of power. On Tuesday afternoon at the Chicago hub, Andre Miller stood up in an overflowing meeting room and spoke with a trembling but determined voice. What happened to Evan is not rare. It happens to us every day. The only difference is no one records it. The room fell silent. Andre continued. They tell us to stay calm. Don't sound harsh. Smile more. Dress in a way that looks trustworthy. But when others make mistakes, it's called a human error. When we react, it's called an attitude problem. A woman in the corner began to cry. Another nodded vigorously, as if someone had finally spoken aloud the words she'd held inside for years. Evan watched from headquarters in Denver. When Andre finished speaking, Evan closed his eyes for a moment, not out of exhaustion, but because he could feel something awakening throughout the entire organization, a truth buried too long. In Houston, an airport hotel held a staff gathering after hours. An employee of Indian descent described being called Taxi Man right at the check-in counter. A Latina employee recalled a co-worker joking she looked more like housekeeping than someone who prints boarding passes. A group of black employees shared how customers repeatedly asked, "Are you sure you're at the right gate?" Each story was a cut, and each cut echoed the wound Evan had just lived through. But while this wave of voices grew stronger, there was one place far from calm, the 27th floor, the board's offices. At that moment, the most powerful people in the company were boiling with anger. In a closed-door meeting, Harold Pierce slammed his hand onto the table. He's shaking the entire company over a personal incident. Do you understand the legal fallout? We're opening the door to a flood of lawsuits. Linda Carver, still shaken from her confrontation with Evan, spoke softly. How long did you expect us to hide this? Evan was humiliated in front of 100 people. And we're making it worse, Harold barked. He's broadcasting internal issues to the entire company. This is like walking into the guillotine voluntarily. Another board member spoke up. Harold, don't you see that the real issue is that something like this could happen inside our own system? Every system has flaws, Harold snapped, but not every flaw needs to turn into a crusade to save the world. A sharp click cut through the room. The door opened. Evan stood there. No one knew how long he had been outside. No one knew how much he had heard. But from the cold steel in his eyes, everyone understood he had heard enough. You think this is a small matter? Evan asked, his voice low, like thunder rolling before a storm. Harold turned, attempting to regain composure. Evan, this I'm just saying, you're blowing this out of proportion. Evan stepped into the room, each step carrying the weight of truths they didn't want to face. You want to know what's out of proportion? Harold, out of proportion is when an employee is told to smile through an insult. Out of proportion is when a customer who looks wealthy earns respect, while someone who doesn't fit the image is treated like a fraud. Out of proportion is when I, the man who built this company, was judged from head to toe and deemed unworthy of seat 1A. Harold cut in. No one is denying it was wrong. Evan slammed his hand onto the table. This time, it was loud, sharp, and made Harold flinch. Being wrong doesn't matter if we don't have the courage to name it. Evan's eyes swept across the room. I once believed silence was a way to survive. I once believed that if I worked hard enough, acted polite enough, carried myself properly, people would respect me. He paused. His voice dropped half a tone, carrying the weight of 45 years of being judged. But what this morning reminded me is this dignity is not something others give me. It is something I protect, even if it means standing against the very system I built. No one spoke. Evan turned to Linda. Start the mentorship program. It's already being prepared. Linda replied softly. Evan turned to Daniel. Create the independent reporting line. No management involvement. We're building it now, Daniel said. And finally Evan said, looking straight at Harold, if anyone in this room believes I'm turning this company into a social crusade, then let me be clear. You understand nothing about justice. Harold's face flushed red, but no words came out. Evan looked around at all of them, and in that moment, they realized something they had never dared consider. Evan Brooks was not just fighting Whitfield. He was fighting the long shadow of prejudice that they, intentionally or not, had allowed to live inside this corporation. When he left the room, Harold exhaled heavily. Linda set her pen down, and most of the board sat frozen, as if they had just endured an earthquake. But the real earthquake came that evening, when Evan returned to his office alone, the lights of Denver reflecting across the tall glass windows. He looked down at the runway below, where hundreds of flights took off and landed each day, where people like him had been overlooked, where a single seat, 1A, had once symbolized who belonged and who did not. Evan placed his hand on the glass. Not out of sorrow, but out of understanding. Real reform does not begin with statements. It begins with refusing to fear the people who will be angry at the change. He was ready to face all of them, and for the first time in years, he no longer felt alone on that battlefield. The employees were rising. The old culture was cracking. The system was shifting in small currents, in steady breaths in shared stories. But Evan knew one thing to tear down the final curtain. The one shielding Whitfield, he would have to face the most personal battle of all. A battle with no lawyers, no boardrooms, no town hall standing between them. Only him. Only the truth. And the man who had dared push him out of seat 1A to bring an entire empire to its knees. Night fell over Denver with a cold so sharp it made even the glass towers seem to tremble, but Evan stood in his office without turning on the lights, watching the city below, as if observing a silent battlefield unfolding between the flickering lights. The desk phone rang the head of legal, informing him that Whitfield had responded. He wasn't panicking like Greg or Kelly. He didn't call to apologize. He didn't ask for a private meeting. Instead, he requested a procedural appointment, a closed-door mediation at an arbitration center in Manhattan. Perfect. Evan replied, his voice soft, but carrying a blade. 2 days later, the mediation room in Manhattan glowed under warm amber lighting so quiet that even the sound of a page turning echoed. Whitfield sat on the opposite side of the table, wearing a silver-gray suit, pressed razor-sharp, his eyes calm as though what he'd done was simply adjusting a stranger's seat. He leaned back, fingers interlaced, a thin smile on his lips, the smile of a man who believed that 3 decades of wealth, power, and connections would shield him from every consequence. Evan Whitfield began, his voice smooth like a stage actor's. I regret the misunderstanding that morning. I'm sure everything can be resolved with a standard expression of regret. Evan looked at him for several seconds, long enough for Whitfield's patience to fray. A statement of regret, Evan repeated. No admission, no accountability, no acknowledgement of what you did. Just a polished little sentence to help you keep your seats on a few more boards. Whitfield chuckled lightly. Evan, you're exaggerating. We both know a seating error is hardly— You pushed me, Evan said, voice low but cutting. Not out of seat 1A. Out of the place you think I don't deserve. Whitfield raised his brows, still trying to appear calm. I didn't push anyone. You're imagining things. Really, Evan tilted his head and tapped his tablet. The assistant's email appeared. The override command appeared. The hallway camera footage from the Atlanta office appeared. Whitfield walking into his private room at 6:45 in the morning, 2 minutes before seat 1. A vanished from Evan's reservation. Whitfield's face tightened for a fraction of a second, so brief an untrained eye might miss it. But Evan saw it. He saw everything. You think I'm angry about a seat, Evan said, stepping closer, each step weighted with truth. I'm angry because you believed I didn't deserve to sit there. You believed I didn't fit the image, not refined enough, not the type who belongs in first class. You believed that if I was humiliated enough, I would lash out and destroy myself. Whitfield let out a bitter laugh. You're turning a simple issue into a matter of race. Evan held his gaze unblinking. There is nothing for me to turn. It already was. The mediation room fell silent. Evan placed the tablet on the table and leaned in, palms flat against the wood. You didn't embarrass me, Thomas. You exposed yourself. And you showed the world something I've always known. Racism is not just slurs shouted across a street. It is subtle. It wears a suit. It carries a law degree. It walks through modern offices. It speaks in soft voices and legal phrasing. It is you. Whitfield narrowed his eyes. So what do you want? Truth, Evan said. And justice. You want me to lose everything? Whitfield asked, trying and failing to keep the tremor out of his voice. Evan shook his head. No. Then he delivered the sentence that froze the entire room. I forgive you. Whitfield leaned back as if struck disbelief spreading across his face. Forgive, what did you just say? Evan stood upright and picked up his tablet. I forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because I refuse to carry the weight of you for even one more day. The mediator exhaled softly, as though witnessing a verdict rendered not with a gavel, but with the quiet force of humanity. Evan turned and walked toward the door without looking back. He did not ask for another apology. He did not ask for surrender, because he knew the real battle wasn't inside this room. It was inside the heart of the company, in the thousands of employees now looking to him as proof that silence was no longer an option. When he stepped outside the building, the Manhattan wind curled around his tie, carrying with it the echo of the confrontation he had just finished. Evan lifted his gaze to the sky. A vast, open blue, free clear, untouched by any seat designed to measure his worth. And he understood the greatest victory was not defeating Whitfield. It was forcing an entire empire to finally look in the mirror and see the cracks they had ignored for far too long. 3 months after the confrontation in Manhattan, Aurora Air had stepped into a new era without a single flashy PR campaign. Change seeped quietly into every hallway, every office, every glance employees exchanged with one another. At headquarters in Denver, the The grand lobby, once filled with market index boards and glossy videos of the fleet, now dedicated an entire section to artworks created by young artists of color. Not as a display piece, not as a diversity badge, but because Evan insisted, if we fly across the world, then we must see the world, not just one narrow version of it. The glass-walled conference rooms, once symbols of transparency, now had the lower halves, frosted, not to hide decisions, but to remove the silent pressure of hierarchy that the people inside unintentionally cast on those outside. Evan wanted everyone to meet each other eye to eye. Across regional hubs, the whispers of diversity higher disappeared. Not because they were banned, but because people finally understood why that phrase had never been true. In the Seattle branch, an Indian-American intern named Maya Patel met Evan for the first time while he was inspecting service protocols. She smiled shyly and said, "You have no idea for people like us. You're proof that leadership isn't born. It's built by standing up at the right moment." Evan laughed, a light, genuine sound he hadn't been able to make in months. Outside of work, Evan's life shifted too. His sister called more often. His 11-year-old niece Naya sent him a drawing, a plane with a black man in a suit sitting in the front row. Beneath it, she wrote, "Uncle Evan." Now everyone knows who belongs in that seat. Evan framed the drawing and placed it in his office. It reminded him that sometimes the greatest changes begin in the smallest eyes. But one piece of the story remained unfinished. Whitfield, although exposed, isolated by the board, and shunned by employees, Evan's lawsuit against him was still in legal dispute. Whitfield was no longer dangerous, yet he remained a wound Evan wasn't ready to close. Until one autumn afternoon when the company inaugurated a new training center in Baltimore, a space Evan envisioned where every employee, regardless of race background or rank, could learn to see one another with genuine respect. Inside the center, a long hallway featured a massive wall covered with photos of employees from around the world: African pilots, Mexican technicians, receptionists from Georgia, Korean-American maintenance staff. A mosaic of lives working together to keep an empire in the sky. At the center of that wall hung the simplest frame. No face, no portrait, just a photo of row 29, the middle seat empty. A soft light shone on the small words beneath it. The seat that changed everything. Evan stood there for a long time. His breath slowed. Not from sadness, but from remembering the exact moment everything began, the laughter at the gate. Kelly's judging eyes, Greg's cold voice, the suffocating feeling of being forced into the seat they believed fit him. It was the most humiliating seat of his life, and the one that freed him from the silence he had carried since he was 19. Evan touched the edge of the frame gently. For the first time in months, he smiled with full ease, the smile of a man who had moved through pain, seen the legacy he was building, and understood that it was bigger than a hostile scheme, bigger than a first-class ticket, bigger than a single flight. It was the legacy of speaking up, of standing tall, of refusing to stay silent. Because now Aurora Air wasn't changing through speeches or CEO memos. It was changing because its people had finally seen the truth, that dignity has no seat assignment, and respect is not a privilege reserved for a chosen few. Before leaving the hallway, Evan turned back to the photo one last time. Not to revisit the humiliation, but to remember a lesson: power does not change who we are. It reveals who we have always been, and Evan Brooks had chosen to be someone who used power to lift others, never to push them down. From the perspective of an expert in organizational culture and systemic power, Evan Brooks's journey is not merely a story about a stolen seat or a hostile takeover. It is proof of a deeper truth that ethical fractures in a company never begin with grand mistakes, but with small moments when people forget one another, when respect slowly shifts from a foundation into a privilege. Evan did not transform Aurora Air through anger. He transformed it through resolve by looking directly at injustice and refusing to stay silent. And it was that refusal that opened the door for thousands of employees to finally speak their own truths. If this journey makes you reflect on how we treat one another in moments that seem insignificant, then like the video to help spread the message, subscribe to follow more stories that reshape systems from the ground up. Before you leave, comment 3 words. Hold your dignity as a reminder that sometimes all it takes is one person standing up for the world to shift